"You've got 30 seconds, old man, then I need you off my parade deck." The staff sergeant didn't even look at him. He was too busy watching 7 young Marines sweat through their dress blues, too busy listening to the ceremonial M14 clatter against the concrete for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. He figured the grey-haired man with the cane wanted a photo or a handshake, or to tell a story nobody had time to hear. What he didn't know was that the old man had once held a rifle at attention in front of 2 presidents, and his hands had never trembled once. He didn't know that in about 4 seconds, every Marine on that field would forget how to breathe. If you believe respect is earned and never expires, type honour in the comments, before you see what that old man did with their rifle. Vernon Mathis had driven 6 hours from a small brick house in Tennessee to sit on a set of aluminum bleachers and watch his grandson learn to fold a flag. That was the whole plan. Sit quietly, stay out of the way, be a face the boy could find in the crowd on Saturday morning when the real ceremony happened and a grieving family came to bury their son. He had left before dawn, the way he'd left before dawn his entire life. The habit of reveille burned so deep into him that no alarm clock had woken him in 50 years. He'd packed a thermos of black coffee and a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and he'd driven the whole way in the slow lane with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, because the quiet suited him now. At a gas station outside Fayetteville, a young man had held the door for him and called him Sir, in the absent way the young say it to the old, and Vernon had thanked him and thought nothing of it. He was used to being a polite blur in other people's afternoons. He was 79 years old, and he wore his age the way some men wear an old field coat. Comfortably, without complaint, every wrinkle earned. His hair had gone the colour of cigarette ash, and he kept it high and tight out of a habit he'd never bothered to break. His hands were spotted and scarred, the knuckles swollen into knots, and there was a tremor in them now that came and went with the weather and the hour. He walked with a cane of dark cherry wood, leaning on it the way a man leans on something he's grateful for and a little embarrassed about. His windbreaker was zipped to the throat even in the heat, because his blood ran cold these days, and his sneakers were the soft white kind they sell to people who have given up on style. Nobody looked at him twice. That was fine by him. He'd spent the last 15 years being invisible, and he'd found a peace in it he never expected to find anywhere. But if you'd watched him closely, really watched, you'd have seen the things the years couldn't erase, the way his spine straightened on its own whenever a flag passed, as if a string ran from the crown of his head to the sky, the way his eyes tracked the young Marines on the field, reading their footwork like a man reading a language he'd once dreamed in, and in the breast pocket of that zipped-up windbreaker, pressed flat against his heart, there was a thin set of dog tags he never took off and never spoke about. The reason he kept his coat zipped wasn't the cold at all. The parade deck at Camp Lejeune shimmered with heat that Thursday afternoon, the kind that rose off the concrete in slow waves and made the distant tree line ripple like something seen through water. The smell of cut grass and rifle oil and hot asphalt hung in the still air. Somewhere beyond the field a formation was running cadence, the sound rolling across the base in a low ancient rhythm, the call and the answer, the same song Marines had been singing into the dirt long before any of these boys were born. 7 young Marines stood in a ragged line at the centre of it all, and they were drowning. They were the base ceremonial detail, a hand-picked honour guard, the youngest of them barely 19, and on Saturday morning they were supposed to render final honours for a Marine sergeant who had come home from his last deployment in a flag-draped transfer case. 3 volleys, a folded flag. A slow, perfect march that a mother and a young widow would carry in their chest for the rest of their lives. It was the kind of duty that means nothing in the world if it's done right, and means everything if it's done wrong. The Marine running them into the ground was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, and Webb was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, though he would have died before admitting it to a living soul. He had 8 years in, a reputation for sharp drill, and a colonel who had told him on Monday that the family of the fallen sergeant included a retired general officer, and that the entire base would be judged by what happened on that field come Saturday. Webb had not slept a full night since. Every fumble felt like his own career hitting the pavement, and the harder he pushed, the worse it got, and the worse it got, the harder he pushed. He was caught in the oldest trap there is. So he screamed. He had been screaming for the better part of an hour, and his voice was already gone to gravel. Among the 7 was a tall, skinny kid, with his grandfather's jaw and his grandfather's careful eyes. Lance Corporal Caleb Mathis, 8 months in the fleet, standing the detail for the first time in his young life. And what none of them knew, not Webb and not the boy, was that the answer to every problem on that field was sitting 40 yards away on an aluminum bench, watching his grandson's hands shake in exactly the way his own had once shaken, a lifetime and an ocean ago. The first fumble had been Caleb's. It happened on the rifle inspection sequence, the part of the drill where the manual of arms moves fast and the weapon spins from hand to hand in a chain of crisp practice snaps. Port arms to inspection arms, the bolt drawn, the chamber shown, the whole thing meant to look effortless precisely because it isn't. The M14 they were using was a ceremonial weapon, demilled and chrome bright, heavier than it looked, better than 9 pounds of walnut and steel that punishes the smallest hesitation. Caleb's grip slipped on the handoff, the rifle rotated a half-inch wrong, and it came down across the concrete with a crack that bounced off the headquarters building like a gunshot. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. "Pick it up," Webb said. Quiet at first, then louder, walking toward the boy with his jaw set hard. "Pick it up, Mathis. You just dropped a service rifle on a parade deck. You understand what that is? That is the single worst thing a Marine can do in dress blues in front of people. On Saturday there is going to be a casket on this field. You planning to drop it in front of his mother?" Caleb's ears went scarlet. He bent, recovered the weapon, brought it back up to inspection arms with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and stared at a fixed point on the horizon the way they teach you to, swallowing it all down. On the bleachers, Vernon Mathis went very still. He did not stand. He did not call out. He had raised his son never to embarrass another Marine standing in formation, and his son had raised Caleb the very same way before the desert took him, and the rule held even now, even while he watched his own grandson get torn open by a man half his age. He simply watched, and his knotted hands folded together in his lap, and his thumb found the worn edge of something through the fabric of his coat and held on to it, the way a drowning man holds a rope he can't see. The second fumble belonged to a different kid entirely. He was a freckled private named Dawson, 19 and raw-boned, and his hands were too big for the handoff, gripping the small of the stock like he was trying to strangle it. When the rifle came across to him on the inspection sequence, 10 minutes later it skidded straight through his fingers and rang off the deck, and Webb spun on him so fast that 2 of the others flinched in formation. "Are you kidding me, Dawson? Are you kidding me right now?" The thing was, the 2 young Marines who fumbled were not the problem, and any drill instructor over the age of 50 would have seen it in a single heartbeat. The team was strung tight as piano wire because the man in charge of them was, and fear runs down a chain of command faster than any order ever written. A frightened hand cannot feel a rifle, it can only clutch. But there was no one over 50 on that field with the authority to say so. There was only an old man on an aluminum bench, his pale eyes moving steadily over the formation, cataloguing every flaw the way he'd done 10,000 times in another life. The rolled shoulder, the choked grip, the eyes that kept dropping to the weapon instead of holding the horizon, biting down hard on a correction that had been bred into the marrow of his bones. The third fumble was the one that broke something loose in the afternoon. This time it was Caleb again, and this time the rifle didn't merely drop. It bounced off the toe of his polished boot and skittered out across the open deck, spinning to a slow stop in the dead centre of the field, where every single person could see it lying there like an accusation laid out on the concrete. Somewhere near the bleachers, a civilian contractor had stopped to watch, and he had his phone up now, recording, the little black eye of it pointed at the whole sorry scene. Webb's voice cracked clean in half when he shouted, and the cruelty that came out was the kind that only ever comes from a man terrified down to his boots of failing. "You are an embarrassment to that uniform, you hear me? Your name is on the roster for Saturday, and I am this close to scratching it. Some family is going to stand right here and watch you, and you cannot hold a rifle still for 90 seconds. It was that word, embarrassment, hurled at the boy who wore his son's jaw, on the field where his son's name should still have meant something, that finally brought Vernon Mathis's swollen hand up to the polished head of his cane. But what made the old man begin to rise was not anger. Anger he had buried decades back, in ground he never visited. It was something far more dangerous to every man standing on that field. The quiet, bottomless certainty of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and knows, beyond all argument and all apology, exactly how it is meant to be done, and cannot in the end sit still and watch it done wrong in front of the dead. Still, he did not move, Not for one more minute, because part of Vernon Mathis was no longer at Camp Lejeune at all. He was standing on another field, 22 years gone, in front of another casket, and this one had his son's name stencilled on the end of it. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mathis had been killed by a roadside bomb outside Fallujah in the spring of 2004, and the Marine Corps had buried him with full honours on a grey Tennessee morning, while a young widow held a 4-year-old boy who did not understand why his daddy would not wake up. Vernon had stood at that graveside in his own dress blues, the last time he ever wore them, and he had watched the funeral detail render final honours for his only child. The volleys splitting the cold air, the bugle, the slow, impossible fold, corner over corner, the flag drawn off the casket and worked into a tight blue triangle with 13 folds and not one wasted motion. Those 7 young Marines that day had been flawless. Not one tremble, not one fumble, not one second of hesitation. It was, Vernon had come to believe in the long years since, the one thing that held his daughter-in-law together that morning. The perfection of it. The mercy and the dignity of it. The way the whole silent ceremony said, without a single spoken word, "Your husband mattered. And we will not get this wrong. Not for him, not today." His wife, Ruth, had stood beside him at that grave with her gloved hand crushing his, and she had whispered, "They did him proud, Vern." It was nearly the last clear thing he could remember her saying before the years took her mind, and then took the rest of her, 4 winters back, in a quiet room with the television murmuring to nobody. He had folded a flag himself, then, for her, the one they gave him at Daniel's service, the one she'd kept on the mantel, and he had set it in her hands in the casket where no honour guard could see, because some folds are private. That was why he was here. That was the whole reason a 79-year-old man drove 6 hours and sat on an aluminum bench in the heat. He knew, better than anyone breathing, what it cost a family to watch the honour guard fumble at the worst moment of their lives, and he knew, just as deeply, what it gave them when the honour guard got it right. On Saturday, some other mother was going to stand on this exact field, and Vernon Mathis was not going to sit there in silence and watch a frightened sergeant turn her son's last farewell into a thing she'd flinch at remembering for the rest of her days. In the breast pocket of his coat were Daniel's dog tags warm from his chest, and folded flat beside them, soft and yellowed with age, was a pair of white cotton parade gloves that Vernon had carried in some pocket or other for 50 years, the way another man might carry a wedding ring he could no longer force over a swollen knuckle. He had worn those gloves in front of 2 presidents. He had worn them on the proudest day and the worst day of his life, sometimes the very same day. He looked down now at his ruined old hands, and for just one moment they did not feel old at all. Then Lance Corporal Caleb Mathis, his grandson, bent to recover the rifle a 3rd time with tears standing bright in his eyes, and Vernon Mathis set his cane against the bleacher rail, planted both hands on his knees, and stood up. He came out across that parade deck slowly, leaning on the cherrywood cane, a small grey figure crossing a wide green expanse, and for a long moment not one person noticed him. The young Marines were locked at attention. Webb was pacing. The contractor kept filming. Then Webb's eyes snagged on the movement at the edge of his field, and his face soured the way a man's does when one more thing goes wrong on a day already full of them. "Sir, this is a closed evolution," he said, raising a hand like a crossing guard. "You need to stay back in the stands." Vernon stopped at a respectful distance. He did not square off. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he had spoken his entire life. Low, even. Every word set down exactly where he meant it to land, no two wasted. "That's my grandson," he said, nodding once toward Caleb. "And that boy is not your problem, Staff Sergeant. Your problem is the spacing on your handoff, and the fact that you've got every one of them so scared they can't feel their own fingers anymore. The rifle's not heavy." He let it sit a beat. "Fear is." Webb's jaw worked. A couple of the young Marines cut their eyes sideways without moving their heads, caught between iron discipline and the sudden electric interest of watching a stranger calmly say the unsayable to the man who'd been screaming at them for an hour. "With respect," Webb said in a tone that held precisely none. "I don't know what you think you understand about ceremonial drill, but this is an active." "I'd like to borrow a rifle," Vernon said. 30 seconds, then I'll go sit back down, and you will never hear another word out of me as long as you live." What Vernon could not see, because his back was now to the headquarters building, was that at the far end of the parade deck, A black government sedan had just turned in off the main road and rolled to a slow stop along the curb, and the man unfolding himself from the back of it had come to Camp Lejeune 2 full days early for one private reason, and had just frozen with one hand still on the open door, staring across the long green field at the silhouette of an old man he had not laid eyes on in 30 years. Staff Sergeant Webb very nearly said no. You could read it in him plainly. The wound-up pride, the bone-deep exhaustion, the part of him that wanted to call the duty NCO and have this old man walk back to the bleachers and be done with the whole humiliating interruption. He had a service to run. He had a colonel on his back and a general's family arriving and a detail that could not hold a rifle. The last thing on God's earth he needed was to be lectured on his own parade deck by somebody's grandfather in a windbreaker. He glanced over at the black sedan idling at the distant curb, registered it as nothing more than one more pair of eyes on an already bad afternoon, and turned back to the old man. "You've got 30 seconds, old man, then I need you off my parade deck." He jerked his chin at Dawson, who hesitated, looked at the other Marines, and then crossed and held the ceremonial M14 out across both open palms, the way you'd offer a sword to someone you weren't sure deserved it. Vernon looked at the rifle for a moment the way you look at the face of someone you used to love and never thought you'd see again. "Hold this," he said, and put his cane into Webb's hands. Webb took it on reflex before he'd thought it through, and that one small thing, the old man's hands suddenly free, his weight settling square and even over both feet, the cane gone clean out of the picture, was the first quiet sign that something on that field had already begun to change. The stoop was gone from his shoulders. Standing flat-footed and balanced, the old man was suddenly a half a head taller than he'd looked a moment before. Behind him, one of the younger Marines made the mistake of laughing under his breath, a short, nervous bark of a sound, and a couple of the others let their mouths twitch into smirks. "This ought to be good," somebody muttered down the line. Vernon Mathis took the rifle in his right hand. He did not shoulder it. He did not bring it up to inspection arms. He simply found the balance point of the weapon with his thumb, that exact narrow spot just forward of the trigger housing, where 9 pounds of walnut and chromed steel will hang in perfect equilibrium if you know precisely where to look, and very nearly nobody on earth knows precisely where to look. He turned the rifle once in his grip, feeling its weight settle. An old conversation between a man and a thing they both remembered. The Garans he'd trained on for half his life had run a pound heavier than this. This little M14 felt like a toy in his hand, and the tremor that had lived in those hands for 15 years, that shook his coffee cup and his signature and his grip on the cane, was simply gone, vanished, as if the honest weight of a rifle had pressed it flat into the ground where it belonged. He extended his right arm out straight. He raised one weathered index finger, and he set the rifle down across the very tip of it. Then he let go with every other part of his hand, the M14 balanced there, dead level, 9 pounds of steel and walnut resting on the single fingertip of a 79-year-old man, and every smirk on that field died at once, snuffed out like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. For half a second nobody believed what they were seeing. It looked like a trick of the heat coming off the deck. Then Vernon's wrist began to turn, slow and smooth and patient, and the rifle started to rotate. One full revolution, the barrel sweeping a flat, clean circle in the air, the weapon never once tilting, never sliding, the balance point pinned to his fingertip as though it had been bolted there in a machine shop. A second rotation, faster now, the bright chrome catching the Carolina sun and throwing a spinning ribbon of white light skating across the concrete and up the front of the headquarters building. A third rotation, and then his hand simply rose up to meet the falling rifle and snapped it down into inspection arms with a crack so clean, so precise, so absolutely final, that it sounded like a single rifle bolt slamming home in a dead silent room. He held it there at perfect inspection arms, the very position he had held in front of 2 presidents of the United States, his spine a plumb line, his chin level, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and he did not so much as blink. Not one human being on that field said a word. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb stood frozen with a cherrywood cane held forgotten in both hands, and the colour was draining out of his face the way water drains out of a cracked glass, slow at first, then all at once. Because Webb was a drill man, down to the bone, and Webb knew exactly how impossibly hard the thing he had just watched was. He knew it was not a trick. He knew it was not a fluke or a circus stunt or the dumb luck of an old man who'd gotten away with something. That balance, that wrist, that snap up into inspection arms without a half degree of waver, that was a lifetime. That was 30 years and 10,000 hours and a kind of mastery that exists in any given decade in maybe a few dozen living human beings on the whole spinning planet. And he had just told one of them he had 30 seconds before he needed him off his parade deck. "Where?" Webb started, and his voice came out wrong, cracked and thin, so he stopped and made himself start again. "Who taught you to do that?" Vernon lowered the rifle out of inspection arms, brought it down through port arms with a soft double snap, and held it back out across both open palms, exactly the way it had been handed to him. "A lot of people," he said quietly. "A long time ago. Most of them are gone now." And from the far end of the field a voice rang out, a voice trained across decades to carry the length of a parade deck without ever seeming to strain, a voice that turned every young head on the detail at once, like a single string pulling 7 puppets. And it spoke one word that none of them understood yet, and not one of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. "Gunny?" The man crossing the parade deck now wore the service uniform of a lieutenant general. 3 silver stars rode the shoulder of each side. He was perhaps 60, broad through the chest and silver at the temples, and he was walking faster than general officers are ever supposed to walk, faster than the dignity of 3 stars permits. And Staff Sergeant Webb felt the bottom drop clean out of his stomach, because he recognized that face from the briefing slides. This was the retired general's son. This was family of the fallen Sergeant Brennan. This was the single most important man scheduled to set foot anywhere on this base all month. The man Webb's colonel had lost sleep over, and he was half running across the open field directly toward the old man Webb had spent the last 5 minutes insulting. The general drew up a few feet from Vernon and stopped. For a long moment the two of them simply looked at one another, and something passed between them in the silence that no one else on that field had the history to read. "Master Guns Mathis," the general said at last. His voice had gone thick and unsteady, all the parade deck steel run out of it. "My God, it really is you. I heard a Mathis was on the detail roster and I prayed. I told myself it couldn't be." "General," Vernon said, and inclined his head a careful degree. "You got tall on me." The general let out a laugh, a wet, astonished, broken open sound. And then, in full view of 7 dumbstruck young Marines and 1 staff sergeant, whose entire career was flickering before his eyes like a bad reel of film, Lieutenant General Aaron Pruitt came to attention on the open concrete and rendered a slow, deliberate holding salute to a 79-year-old man standing in a zipped-up windbreaker and soft white sneakers. "This man," Pruitt said, and he did not lower his hand, his eyes sweeping the length of the frozen detail, "is Master Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Mathis, United States Marine Corps, retired. Some of you don't know that name. You should. You should have it tattooed on the inside of your eyelids. For 11 years this Marine served as a rifle inspector, and then as the drill master of the silent drill platoon at Marine Barracks, Washington. 8th and I. The Marines on the recruiting posters your fathers signed their names under. He trained half of them. He performed for 2 sitting presidents of the United States. There is not a Marine drawing breath on this earth who has handled a ceremonial rifle with more precision than the man you have spent this afternoon laughing at." He held the salute 1 beat longer. Then he brought his hand down sharp, but he was not finished. Not nearly. "And I'll tell you something else," Pruitt said, his voice dropping, going somewhere quieter and far heavier. "That is not the reason I am saluting him." What Lieutenant General Pruitt said next, those 7 young Marines would carry in their chests for the rest of their natural lives, because it turned the quiet old man on the bleachers from a curiosity into something none of them had words large enough to hold, and it explained the dog tags pressed flat against his heart, and the white gloves folded soft in his pocket, and the 6 hours he had driven before dawn just to watch a boy learn to fold a flag. "In May of 1968, Pruitt said, and the parade deck voice came back, steady now, made to be heard at the far ranks. A rifle company got pinned down in a dry riverbed in the Ashore Valley. Crossfire from 3 sides. My father was a 19-year-old corporal in that company. He was shot through both legs, and he was lying out in the open in the killing ground, and every man who looked at him had already written him off. The Marine who went back out into that fire for him, twice, and got a tourniquet on him, and then carried him very nearly 2 miles to the landing zone with a North Vietnamese round through his own shoulder, was a young sergeant by the name of Vernon Mathis." Pruitt's jaw tightened until the muscle stood out. He was awarded the Navy Cross for what he did that day. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. And in all the years I knew this man as a boy, and I knew him as the steadiest, kindest, most patient man who ever came to my father's house. He never once mentioned it to me, not one time. I learned it from the citation, framed and hung on my father's wall, on the day we buried my dad. The general's eyes came up and moved slowly across the detail, man by man. I am standing here in 3 stars, he said, because this man would not leave a wounded Marine to die in a riverbed. So you will treat him accordingly, every one of you, for the rest of your lives. Webb knew the words, more or less. Every Marine did. The Navy Cross citation was the kind they made you study, the kind read aloud at promotion ceremonies and copied into the unit histories. Extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, intrepidity at grave risk of his own life above and beyond the call of duty. Cold, formal, bloodless language stamped permanently onto the single worst afternoon of a young man's existence. But what no citation has ever managed to capture was the part Vernon himself had never once spoken aloud. The impossible weight of a grown man across your shoulders when your own legs are buckling beneath you. The particular sound a wounded 19-year-old makes when he stops believing he will ever see his mother again. The cold arithmetic you run in your head about whether the next 40 yards through that riverbed will simply get you both killed. And then crossing them anyway, twice. Because the alternative was a thing you understood you could not live alongside for the remainder of your years. The decoration was real. The ribbon in the shadow box was real. But the only honest record of what truly happened in the Ashau had walked off that battlefield locked inside one quiet non-commissioned officer and had stayed locked there for 57 years, behind a zipped windbreaker, beside a dead son's dog tags, never shown, never spoken, never spent. It was Caleb who broke first. The boy's careful face crumpled all at once, the discipline going out of it like air out of a tyre, because in 19 years of fishing trips and birthday cards and afternoons asleep in the recliner, his grandfather had never told him a single word of any of it. Not the platoon, not the presidents, not the riverbed in the Ashau, not the cross. The quiet old man who taught him to bait a hook and let him win at checkers had carried all of that folded up small and silent inside his zipped windbreaker, the very same way he carried his dead son's dog tags against his heart. Close and constant, and never once shown to a living soul. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb did not move for a long, long moment. When he finally did move, it was to walk slowly around and place himself directly in front of Vernon, and the cherrywood cane he still held seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in his hands now. 8 years of hard-earned, sharp-edged drill instructor armour, all the volume and the pride and the white-knuckled fear of failing, had nothing in it anywhere to prepare a man for this. He had built his entire afternoon on the rock-solid certainty that he was the single most knowledgeable man standing on that field. He had been wrong by 50 years, a riverbed, 2 presidents, and a Navy Cross. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," Webb said, and his voice barely held together, "I owe you an apology, out loud, in front of my Marines. Since it was in front of them, I did it. I looked at an old coat and a cane, and I made a decision about a man's whole worth in about 2 seconds flat. That is beneath the uniform I'm wearing, and it is beneath everything you just got done teaching these kids without saying a word. I'm sorry, Master Guns, truly." He held the cane out across both open palms, the exact gesture, down to the angle of the wrists with which the rifle had been offered to Vernon, and somewhere inside that small, deliberate echo, the whole long afternoon turned over and came to rest on its other side. Vernon took the cane back into his swollen hands. He looked at the young staff sergeant for a long moment, and there was no triumph anywhere in his weathered face, none of the satisfaction a smaller man would surely have let himself feel, having earned it. There was only the deep tiredness of someone who has watched this exact story play itself out over 60 years and 100 parade decks, and who has never once enjoyed the part where the proud young man finally learns. "You're not a bad drill instructor, son," Vernon said. "You're a scared one, and there's a world of difference between the two, and your Marines can feel which one you are before you ever open your mouth. A rifle weighs 9 pounds. He shifted his grip on the cane. "Fear weighs 100. You've spent this whole afternoon making these kids carry both at once, and then hollering at 'em for stumbling under the load." He let his pale eyes travel down the line of 7 young faces, every one of them watching him now like he was something that had walked out of a history book, then brought them back to Webb. "I buried a son in dress blues," he said more quietly. "Right field like this one. And the honour guard that morning didn't drop a single thing. And I have spent 22 years thinking about why that was. It wasn't because somebody screamed them straight. It was because somebody, somewhere down the line, taught them they could not fail, and then that somebody made them believe it, all the way down. That's the whole secret. That's all of it. There isn't any more than that. He turned the cane slowly in his hands and looked back toward the headquarters building, where the world had stopped to watch. Saturday matters, he said. Some mother is going to stand right here on this concrete and watch you boys carry her son. So, he drew a breath. If you'll have an old man on your parade deck a little longer than 30 seconds, Staff Sergeant, I've got 3 days before I have to point my truck back at Tennessee, and I taught this for 30 years. And as Lieutenant General Pruitt stood quietly off to one side with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the man who had carried his father out of a riverbed begin to walk a line of nervous young Marines through a simple rifle handoff, gently, patiently, without raising his ruined voice a single time, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb came to understand that the most important lesson taught on that field all week was never going to be about a rifle at all. For the next 3 afternoons, Vernon Mathis stood out on that parade deck in his zipped windbreaker and his soft white sneakers, leaning on his cherrywood cane, and one motion at a time, he rebuilt the Camp Lejeune base honor guard from the grip up. He never screamed. He never lifted his ruined voice above the level of a man telling a slow story on a back porch in the evening. He showed them where the balance point of the rifle truly lived, and how the weapon would do most of the work for them if they would only stop wrestling it like it was trying to get away. He taught them to breathe out through the handoff, slow so their hearts ticked down instead of racing up, because a calm hand can feel a rifle, he told them, and a scared hand can only ever clutch at it. He pulled the freckled Private Dawson off to the side and fixed his choking grip in about 90 quiet seconds flat, a flaw Webb had been screaming himself hoarse about for the better part of a week. And he stood close beside his grandson, the two of them sharing the same careful eyes and the same set jaw across 60 years, and he laid his swollen old hands over Caleb's young steady ones and walked him through the inspection sequence again and again and again, until the trembling went out of the boy and did not come back. Staff Sergeant Webb worked at the old man's shoulder the entire 3 days, and something locked tight inside the younger man slowly began to ease. He stopped treating every fumble like the last day of his career. He started teaching the way Vernon taught, low and patient, building men up into something instead of grinding them down into nothing. And a strange thing happened that no amount of screaming had ever managed to make happen. The detail got sharp, crisp, then beautiful. 7 sets of hands moving as one set of hands. On Saturday morning, the family of Sergeant Eli Brennan came to Camp Lejeune to lay their son and brother and husband to rest, and 7 young Marines in immaculate dress blues rendered final honours on that parade deck under a high, clean, cloudless sky. 3 volleys, sharp and even, rolling out across the base and back, the long, slow march, and then the flag, lifted from the casket and folded, corner over corner over corner, into a tight blue triangle of 13 folds. Not one wasted motion in the whole of it, not one tremble in a single hand. Lance Corporal Caleb Mathis carried that folded flag the final distance, and knelt, and placed it gently into the hands of the dead Marine's mother, and spoke the words about a grateful nation, and his own hands did not shake at all. In the second row of folding chairs, an old man in a borrowed set of dress blues that no longer fit him, quite the way they once had sat with his back perfectly straight, white cotton parade gloves on his swollen hands at long last, his son's dog tags warm against his chest, and watched his grandson do the very thing he had spent his entire life perfecting, and do it perfectly, for a family on the worst morning of their lives. Lieutenant General Aaron Pruitt sat in the chair beside him, in his service uniform, 3 silver stars catching the morning light. Neither of the 2 men said a single word to the other through the whole of it. They did not need to. They had said everything there was to say 30 years ago and again on a green field 3 days back, and some things between men are kept, like certain folds, in private. There is a lie we tell ourselves a dozen times a day without ever once noticing we're telling it, that we can read a man's whole worth straight off his clothes, his age, the slow, careful way he leans on a cane. We look at the grey and the quiet and the slow, and we file them away in the back of our minds as people the world is more or less finished using. But the riverbeds they crossed, the presidents they stood before, the only sons they buried with their own steady hands, none of that ever shows on the outside. It never did. It never will. Vernon Mathis drove his truck home to Tennessee that following Sunday and fell asleep in his recliner with the television murmuring, "An ordinary old man once again to every stranger who'd pass him at the gas station and call him Sir, without ever once meaning it. But a whole base full of young Marines now carried the truth of him, that the most dangerous, most remarkable person in any room you will ever walk into is very often the quiet one in the corner who has already done the impossible thing you assume can't be done, and simply never felt any need to mention it. If that landed somewhere true in you, if you believe that honour doesn't retire and respect doesn't expire, then subscribe and stay with these stories, and go find an old veteran in your own life and tell them, out loud, that you see them, while there is still time left to say it.